The day Hazel Whitlock turned 16, the world she had known for 6 years ended in a single sentence read aloud in a cold dining hall. It was a Tuesday in March 1942. The wind off the Kanawha River had been mean all week. The kind of wind that finds the cracks in old buildings and reminds the people inside them that the world is bigger than their walls. Hazel sat at her usual place at the long oak table, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight, the way Sister Margaret had taught her, and her gray wool dress buttoned to the throat. She was the oldest girl in the room. She was also in a way that no one had said aloud yet, but that everyone understood the next one to go. Sister Margaret stood at the head of the table with an envelope in her hand. The envelope was brown and creased and bore a return address from a town Hazel had never heard of. Whitesville, West Virginia. Boone County. The name of a lawyer she did not know. Sister Margaret cleared her throat the way she always did before saying something she wanted the whole hall to hear. And then she began to read. She read about a woman named Cora Whitlock, who had died 3 months ago, in a hollow in the mountains. She read that this woman had been Hazel's grandmother on her mother's side, though Hazel had never laid eyes on her. She read that the woman had left her granddaughter everything she owned. Then she read the list. 14 acres of steep wooded hillside, a dwelling in disrepair, a limestone cave formation of no commercial value, currently inaccessible due to overgrowth. The pause that followed was the kind of pause that has weight to it. Hazel felt it settle across her shoulders like a wet coat. Then the laughter started. It started small, a single nun near the kitchen who tried to hide it behind her hand, and then it spread the way fire spreads in dry timber. The younger girls laughed because the older girls were laughing. The older girls laughed because they were not the ones who had just inherited a hole in a mountain. Sister Margaret did not stop them. She let them laugh until they ran out of laughter. And then she folded the letter and looked at Hazel with an expression that was not unkind exactly, but was not warm either. It was the expression of a woman closing a ledger. "You are no longer the state's problem," she said. Those were the words, the state's problem. As if Hazel were a pothole or a leaking pipe. As if she were a thing someone had finally decided was not worth repairing. She did not cry. She had stopped crying in this place around the age of 12 when she figured out that tears were a currency that bought nothing here. She just nodded and she stood up and she walked back to the dormitory where she packed her 2 dresses and her notebook into a canvas sack while the laughter still echoed in the hall below. That afternoon, they gave her the envelope, a $5 bill, a pair of shoes that did not fit, and a one-way ticket on the Greyhound bus to Whitesville. They did not give her an umbrella. It was raining when she walked through the iron gate of the Sisters of Mercy Home for Girls for the last time, and she walked through it without looking back. Because looking back was another thing. She had given up around the age of 12. She was 16 years old. She had 8 grades of school and a head full of stolen books. She had no aunts and no uncles and no living family, except a grandmother who had been dead for 3 months. And she had a deed to a cave that nobody wanted. The bus took 6 hours. It crossed the Kanawha at Charleston, climbed the long grade up into the coal counties, and let her off at a Greyhound station that was really just a porch behind a feed store. The town of Whitesville lay below the road in a long, narrow strip along the creek, gray and tired in the late afternoon light. Coal smoke hung over the rooftops. A train whistle moaned somewhere out beyond the bend. Men in dirty work clothes stood on the porch of the feed store and watched her step down off the bus. And they watched her with a kind of slow Appalachian curiosity that wasn't quite friendly and wasn't quite anything else. She walked into the feed store and asked for Mr. Caldwell. The man behind the counter looked her up and down. He chewed his tobacco for a long time before he answered. "You the Whitlock girl?" he said. It was not a question. She nodded. He pointed across the street to a building with a peeling sign that read, "Caldwell and Sons Attorneys at Law." Except there were no sons listed beneath the name and looked like it had been added in pencil years ago. Mr. Caldwell was a round man with tobacco-stained fingers and a face like an old saddle. His office smelled of pipe smoke and kerosene and dog. There was, in fact, a dog asleep under the desk, a big yellow hound that did not lift its head when Hazel walked in. Mr. Caldwell stood up and shook her hand the way a man shakes hands with another man, firm and brief and without ceremony. "You favor your mother," he said. "I knew her when she was about your age, before she left." Hazel did not know what to say to that. Her mother had never spoken about this place. Her mother had never spoken about any place. Her mother had only spoken in the last weeks before the scarlet fever took her about how Hazel was to be a strong girl and a quiet girl and a girl who kept her head up no matter what anyone said. Then the fever had done its work and the state had come and the state had taken Hazel to Charleston, and that had been the end of any conversation about her mother. Mr. Caldwell sat down behind his desk. He pulled a folder from a drawer. He pushed it across the wood toward her. "Your grandmother," he said, "was a particular woman." Hazel had not heard the word used that way before, but she understood it. In these mountains, particular was the word people used when they meant strange and did not want to be unkind about it. Particular meant a woman who lived alone, who did not come to church, who grew things people did not understand, who let the forest do what it wanted with her property. Particular meant someone you left alone, and who left you alone in return. She lived up in Kenny's Creek Hollow for near 40 years, he said. Came down to town twice a year for sugar and salt. Spoke to nobody. Folks left her alone on account of her being particular. He paused. And on account of her being a Whitlock. There's history with that name in this county. Old history. Not the kind you want to dig up on your first day. What kind of history? Hazel said. Mr. Caldwell looked at her over the rims of his spectacles. He chewed the inside of his cheek for a moment. Your grandfather, he said. The first Whitlock to come into this hollow. He died young. Killed, some say. Your grandmother never talked about it. She came up here a young widow in 1910, and she set to work, and she did not stop working until they put her in the ground last December. He shrugged. That's all I know. The rest, if there is a rest, is in the cabin somewhere. She left papers. She left books. She left, I am told, a great many jars. Whatever else she left, it's yours now. The deed is in this folder. The key is on top of it. I'll drive you up. It's about 12 miles, and the road runs out before you get there. He drove her in a pickup truck that smelled the way his office smelled, only worse. The road climbed up out of Whitesville along the creek, narrow and rutted, the asphalt giving way to gravel, and the gravel giving way to mud. The mountains rose on both sides, dark with rhododendron and laurel. The bare branches of hardwoods just beginning to fuzz green at the tips. They passed 3 cabins along the way. Each one had smoke coming out of the chimney, and a hound dog on the porch, and a man somewhere in the yard who stopped what he was doing to watch the truck pass. None of them waved. The truck stopped where the road did. There was no turnaround. There was no driveway. There was just a place where the gravel ended and a footpath began 2 ruts in the mud that disappeared into a tunnel of rhododendron so thick the daylight could barely find its way through. Mr. Caldwell did not get out of the truck. He handed her the key. He handed her the $5 bill which the sisters had passed to him in some envelope she had not been shown, and which he had now decided was hers to keep. He shook her hand again. The cabin is about a quarter mile up the path, he said. The cave is behind it, somewhere in the hillside. I would not advise looking for it. Why not? He thought about how to answer that. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his thinning hair and put the hat back on. Because nobody has been near that cave in 20 years, he said. Your grandmother let the vines grow over it. Whatever she had in there, she did not want anyone to find. That should tell you something. It told her something. It did not tell her to leave it alone. She watched the truck back up the narrow road and disappear around the curve. And then she stood there, in the quiet with the creek somewhere down below, making its small, constant music. And she thought, this is either the beginning of something or the end of everything. There is no middle ground here. I am 16 years old, and I am alone in a hollow in the mountains, and nobody in the world knows my name, except a lawyer who has already driven away. She picked up her canvas sack. She started up the path. The cabin was smaller than she had pictured, and stronger than she had feared. Hewn logs daubed with clay, a stone chimney standing solid against the back wall, a roof of split shingles that had lost a few in the winter storms, but was still mostly weather-tight. There was a covered porch with a single rocking chair on it, and the rocking chair was still rocking very slightly. In some breath of wind Hazel could not feel. There was a hand pump in the side yard. There was a small fenced patch where a garden had been. There was a woodshed half full of seasoned oak. Everything had the look of a place that had been kept up carefully for a long time, and then in the last year or so allowed to begin its slow return to the woods. She fitted the key into the door. The door opened on a single room that smelled of cold ash and dry herbs. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. There was a bed in the corner with a faded quilt folded neatly across the foot. There was a wood cook stove, black with use and polished with care. There was a stone fireplace that had not had a fire in it for some time. There was a plank floor swept clean. There was a table in the center of the room with 2 chairs at it. And on the table, set out in a row as if for inspection, were 3 things: a tin cup, a pencil, and an open journal with a fountain pen laid across the page. She walked to the table the way a person walks toward a sound, in the dark. The walls of the cabin she now saw were covered, not with paintings, not with photographs, with charts, hand-drawn charts on heavy paper, each one carefully labeled, each one pinned in place with thumbtacks. There were cross-sections of root systems, diagrams of fungal networks branching like nerves through dark soil, maps of the hillside above the cabin, marked with arrows for sun exposure and water flow, a chart of the cave system drawn from above with chambers and passages labeled in a small, precise hand. Hazel's eyes went to that one and stayed there for a long moment before she made herself look away. The windowsills held jars, dozens of them, each one filled with dried plant matter, each one labeled in the same precise hand: golden seal, bloodroot, lobelia, black cohosh, names she had read in stolen books and never expected to see in a real place. She pulled out the chair at the table. She sat down. She drew the journal toward her with the tip of one finger, as if it might bite. The handwriting on the open page was shakier than the handwriting on the charts and the jars. The pen had wandered a little in the last few lines, the way a pen wanders when the hand holding it is tired or sick or afraid. The date at the top of the page was December 14th, 1941. 3 months before today. Hazel read the page. Then she read it again. Then she pressed her palms flat against the table and breathed because the room had become very still, and her chest had become very tight, and she could feel something turning over in her that she did not yet have a name for. The cave holds everything the page said. If she comes, if the girl comes, she must clear the entrance. She must see what I built. The vines are the door. What is behind them is the answer. I am sorry, Hazel. I have waited so long. I waited from the year your mother left me in the autumn of 1925, when she stood in this room and told me she could not live the way I lived, and that she was carrying a child, and that if it was a daughter, she would name her Hazel, because Hazel is the wood of the divining rod, the wood that finds water in dry places. I waited 17 years. I am dying now. The cave will wait for you as I have waited. Come, clear the door. The vines are not the obstacle. They are the test. Hazel sat in the chair for a long time. The light in the cabin changed. The shadows moved along the floor. A wood thrush sang somewhere out in the laurel, its slow water flute song winding up and around and away. She had been waiting for me, Hazel thought. A grandmother I never met had been waiting for me for 17 years. She had set the table. She had laid out the pen. She had written my name. She had died 3 months ago with her hands still reaching out toward a girl she had never seen. She did not cry. She had given that up at 12. But she did press her hand against the page where the ink of her name was, and she did sit there until the light had moved all the way across the room and begun to climb the far wall. And when she stood up like a person who had just been given a job. She went outside. She walked around to the back of the cabin. She looked up at the hillside that rose behind it. The hillside was a wall of green. It went up maybe 200 feet to the ridge. It was steep. It was choked. Kudzu had come into the lower slope in thick, ropey curtains, the leaves still tight and folded from winter. But the vines themselves alive, twisted around themselves in mats, so dense she could not see the rock beneath. Wild grapevines as thick as her wrist threaded through the kudzu. Virginia creeper climbed underneath all of it. Honeysuckle filled in the gaps. Somewhere behind that wall of vegetation, her grandmother had told her, was the door. She stood there until the light failed. She did not yet know where the entrance was. She did not yet know how she would clear it, or how long it would take, or what it would cost her. But she stood there long enough to understand one thing. She was not going back. There was no back to go to. That first night, she made a small fire in the stove with kindling from the woodshed. She heated water from the pump. She washed her face and her hands, and she sat at the table with her grandmother's journal and read by the light of a kerosene lamp she had found on the mantel. The lamp was old, and the wick needed trimming, and the glass chimney had a hairline crack in it that her grandmother had patched with a wrap of waxed thread. Everything in the cabin had been used, repaired, kept. Nothing had been thrown away. That was a kind of philosophy, and Hazel recognized it. Outside, somewhere down the slope toward the creek, a sound began. It was a heavy snuffling sound, low and patient. The sound of something large moving through brush. Hazel went still. She listened. The sound moved along the back of the cabin, and then around toward the woodshed. And then it stopped. She heard a long, slow breath through what could only be a very large nose. She heard a paw scrape on the boards of the porch. Black bear, she thought. Out early. Hungry. She had no firearm. She had a kerosene lamp and a paring knife and a fireplace poker. She took the poker in her hand, and she sat down in the chair facing the door, and she did not move for what felt like an hour. The bear eventually moved on. She heard it crash through the laurel down toward the creek. She heard the snuffling fade. She set the poker across her knees. She did not sleep. When the gray light of dawn began to lift the edges of the world, she stood up and she put on her mother's old wool jacket, and she went out into the yard to find her grandmother's tools. There was a tool shed behind the woodshed. Inside the shed, she found what a person who has worked hard for 40 years leaves behind. A rusted hand sickle, a double-bit axe with a hickory handle worn smooth by use, a short-handled mattock, a pry bar, a pair of leather gloves so stiff with old sweat they crackled when she pulled them on, a bow saw with a broken blade, and a spare blade in a paper sleeve hanging from a nail. She took the sickle. She took the gloves. She walked around the cabin to the green wall, and she looked up at it, and she said out loud to nobody, to her grandmother, to the bear that had passed in the night, to whatever girl she was about to become, "All right, show me." She had been working on the vines for less than an hour when she heard the engine. It came up the dirt road slow and steady, climbing in low gear. And it stopped where the road stopped where Mr. Caldwell had stopped the day before. She heard the engine cut. She heard a door open and close. She heard boots on gravel. Then she heard boots on the path coming up toward the cabin, taking their time. She came down off the slope, wiping her hands on the legs of her dress. By the time the man stepped out of the rhododendron tunnel into the dooryard, she was standing on the porch with the sickle still in her hand. She did not put it down. She did not raise it either. She just held it the way a woman holds a thing she has been using. The man was big, not tall so much as solid. The kind of solid a man gets from sitting behind a desk after spending 20 years not sitting behind one. He wore a heavy wool coat the color of dried tobacco and a hat with a band of sweat darkened into the felt. His boots were good boots, oiled expensive. His face was clean-shaven and ruddy, and his eyes were a pale blue that did not match the rest of him. He was somewhere on the wrong side of 50. He took off his hat when he saw her, which was a courtesy, but he did not smile, which was not. "You'd be the granddaughter," he said. "I would." "Earl Tanner." He did not offer a hand. "I own the Black Fork mine, other side of the ridge." He nodded at the hillside behind her. "I knew your grandmother, after a fashion." After what fashion? He almost smiled at that. He decided not to. The fashion of a man who tried to do business with her for 20 years and got nowhere. He said, "I made her offers. Fair offers. She turned them all down. Sometimes she didn't answer the door. Sometimes she answered the door with a shotgun across her arm. I don't hold it against her. A woman alone has a right to be careful." He looked past Hazel at the cabin, then at the slope behind it, and his eyes lingered there a moment longer than they needed to. "But she's gone now, and you are 16 years old, and this is not a place for a 16-year-old girl. What kind of place would it be then?" He looked back at her. The pale blue eyes settled on her face. "A cold one," he said. "A hard one. Last winter we lost an old man not 3 miles from here. Froze in his own kitchen. They didn't find him for a month. The hollows up this creek take what they can take. They are not friendly to people who do not know what they are doing." He paused. "I am prepared to be generous." "How generous?" $50 cash, today. And a ticket on the Greyhound to any town east of the Mississippi you want to name. Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Philadelphia. A girl can find work in any of those towns. A girl your age with a little money in her pocket can start a life. He spread his hands. "Out here you cannot start a life. Out here you can only end one." Hazel said nothing. Mr. Tanner waited. When she did not speak, he tried again in a different voice, softer, the voice of a man explaining something to a child. "This land is 14 acres of rock and timber," he said. "The cabin needs a new roof. The cave behind it is sealed up with 30 years of overgrowth, and there is nothing in it but bats and damp. Your grandmother lived up here because she had nowhere else to be. You do. I am offering you a way to that somewhere else." He looked at the sickle in her hand. "And you are offering me, as far as I can tell, an answer I have not yet heard." She had not yet heard the offer either. She heard it now. She heard underneath the soft voice and the generous numbers what was actually in it. He had been trying to buy this hollow for 20 years. He was not trying to buy it because he was kind. He was not trying to buy it because he wanted to help a 16-year-old orphan find work in Pittsburgh. He was trying to buy it because there was something on it or under it that he wanted. Her father had been a coal miner. Her father had walked into a mountain in 1932 and not walked back out. Her father had taught her in the few years she had him exactly one thing about coal, that the men who owned the mines did not make offers without a reason. The black seam, she thought, underneath this hillside, underneath the cave. He has known about it for 20 years. She raised her chin a quarter of an inch. It was not much, but a man like Earl Tanner had spent a life reading small movements in other people's faces, and he saw it. "Mr. Tanner," she said, "my answer is no." He did not answer right away. He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the slope. He set his hat back on his head and pulled the brim down a careful half-inch. "You're 16 years old," he said. "I'm aware. You do not yet understand what you have just turned down. I understand fine." He let a small breath out through his nose. It was not quite a laugh. It was the sound a man makes when he has been told that a door he has been pushing on for 20 years is still not going to open today. "I'll be back," he said. "I expect you will." He touched the brim of his hat. He turned. He walked back down the path the way he had come, and he did not look back. She heard the engine start. She heard it back down the road. She heard it fade. She stood on the porch with the sickle still in her hand, and she felt her heart beating slow and steady against her ribs. And she understood for the first time that her grandmother had not just been waiting for her. Her grandmother had been protecting the hollow from this man for 40 years. Now, her grandmother was dead. Now the hollow was Hazel's. Now the protecting was Hazel's too. She went back up the slope. She started cutting vines. The first day she cut until her hands bled through her grandmother's stiff gloves. She cut kudzu at the root and pulled it down off the rock in great green sheets that piled around her ankles. She cut grapevines with the sickle, and when the sickle would not cut them, she chopped at them with the axe. She uncovered limestone she had not known was there. Pale gray rock streaked with the rust marks of long-running water. She found a chipmunk's nest in a hollow at the base of a vine, and she moved the nest carefully to a sheltered place under the woodshed. She found a copperhead curled in a sunny crack, and she went around it and let it be. She drank from the hand pump, and she ate cold cornbread from a tin she had found in the cabin, and she went back to cutting. The second day she cut from dawn to dusk. She moved along the rock face 6 feet at a time. She uncovered moss-lichen hairline fissures in the stone where mineral water had wept for centuries. She uncovered a place where the rock had been chipped flat, as if by a chisel, but the marks were so faint with weather that she could not yet read what was on it. She did not stop to look. She kept cutting. The third day was the day she felt it. She was working with her face close to the rock, sawing through a grapevine. The thickness of her thumb and the wind died for a moment, and the air in front of her changed. It was not a wind. There was no wind. It was a slow, steady exhalation from somewhere deep inside the hillside, cool and damp and constant. The breath of stone that has been breathing the same breath for 1,000 years. It touched her sweating face. It smelled of wet limestone, and old wood, and something else. Something faintly sweet and earthy that she did not recognize, but that her body recognized for her because the small hairs on her arms rose all at once. She dropped the sickle. She picked up the axe. She cut faster. She cut through grapevines as thick as a man's wrist. She tore at kudzu roots that had buried themselves in the limestone like cables holding the mountain shut. She bled. She did not stop. The sun crossed the sky and began to slant down through the canopy, and the light came through the leaves at a low angle, and the green wall in front of her began to thin, and behind the green she began to see darkness. Not shadow. Darkness. The darkness of a thing that has its own depth. She cleared a patch the size of a window, then a patch the size of a door. Then she stopped and she stepped back and she stood breathing hard with the axe hanging in her hand, and she looked at what she had uncovered. The opening was about 5 feet wide and a little over 6 feet tall, framed in pale limestone, the floor of it dropping away into a smooth black throat that ran back into the hill. Cold air poured out of it steady as a held breath. The rock around the opening had been worked. Not much, just enough. The corners had been squared by a chisel. The lip had been smoothed. Above the lip, where the limestone rose into the natural curve of the hillside, someone had cut letters into the stone. The letters were old. Lichen had grown in their grooves, but they were deep and they were clear, and Hazel did not need to lean in to read them. C. Whitlock, 1913. She stared at them a long time. Her grandmother had come to this hollow in 1910. By 1913, she had found this opening in the side of the mountain, and she had taken a chisel, and she had carved her name into the rock above it, the way a man marks a claim. 29 years ago, 11 years before Hazel's mother was born, 16 years before Hazel's father went down into the mountain at Black Fork and did not come back up. 30 years of patient secret work in a hole in a hill that nobody else had ever seen. She set the axe down at the base of the rock. She walked back to the cabin in the failing light. She lit the kerosene lamp she had used the night before. She trimmed the wick the way her grandmother had probably trimmed it 10,000 times. She filled it with fresh kerosene from the can in the tool shed. She tested the flame in the doorway. She put on her grandmother's wool jacket, which fit her almost exactly as if it had been waiting for her. She walked back up the slope in the dusk with the lamp burning low in her hand. She stood in front of the dark opening. She lifted the lamp. The light barely reached past the lip of the rock. Beyond that lip, the throat of the cave dropped away into a cold black that swallowed sound. She thought about Earl Tanner. She thought about the look in his eyes when he had glanced up at this slope. She thought about her father's lamp found in the rubble in 1932, with no body anywhere near it. She thought about her mother standing in this cabin in the autumn of 1925, carrying her in her belly, saying she could not live the way her own mother lived. She thought about a grandmother she had never met, sitting at a table 3 months ago, writing her name in a journal with a trembling hand. The vines are not the obstacle, they are the test. She stepped through the opening into the dark. The first chamber was nothing more than a passage. It was maybe 8 feet wide, and just tall enough that she did not have to duck, and it ran back into the hillside about 30 feet before it bent. The walls were damp limestone pale gray in the lamplight, streaked with the slow dark stripes of mineral water that had been finding its way down through the rock for longer than anyone alive could measure. The floor was smooth. The floor had been smooth before her grandmother had ever set foot in here. Smooth by centuries of slow seepage, and Hazel's boots made almost no sound on it. Her own breathing was the loudest thing in the world. The lamp threw a small yellow circle in front of her. The dark closed in behind her. She did not look back. She walked forward. At the bend in the passage, she felt the air change again. The cool, steady exhalation that had touched her face outside grew steadier, more humid, more sweet. The faint, earthy smell she had not been able to name on the hillside grew stronger here, and now she could name part of it, because she had read about it in stolen books and because some part of her body had been waiting all her life to recognize it. It was the smell of fungus, of mycelium working in the dark, of life that does not need light to live. She turned the bend. The passage opened. She stopped. She lifted the lamp higher. The light went out across a space so much larger than the passage that for a long second her mind refused to understand what her eyes were telling it. The chamber was enormous. The ceiling arched up beyond the reach of the lamp into a dome she could not measure. The floor stretched away into shadow. The far wall was somewhere out past the edge of the light. She felt the size of it the way you feel the size of a barn the first time you walk into one as a child. Except this was no barn. This was something a mountain had made, and then a woman had spent 30 years turning into something else. And on every surface the mushrooms grew. They grew from logs. The logs were laid out in long, careful rows along the floor of the chamber. Oak and poplar, she could tell the bark still on them, cut to uniform lengths and stacked into low pyramids, with the cut ends facing out. From those cut ends in pale clusters and dark fans and tight brown caps, mushrooms pushed up out of the wood, as if the wood had decided all on its own to make 100 small bouquets. They grew from shelves carved into the limestone walls, long ledges that her grandmother must have chipped out with a hammer and chisel, over years filled with a dark, loose substrate that smelled of forest floor. And out of that substrate came mushrooms in every shape Hazel had ever read about, and several she had not. They grew from canvas bags hung from a wooden frame bolted into the ceiling. The bags stained dark with use, mushrooms cascading down out of slits in the canvas in pale, fluted clusters that caught the lamplight and seemed to glow with their own soft light. There were thousands of them. She did not count. She could not have counted. She walked forward into the chamber the way a person walks into a church. The lamp trembled in her hand, and the shadows of the log stacks moved with her, and on her left, she passed a row of pearl-gray oyster mushrooms fanning out from the end of a poplar log in 3 overlapping shelves, each shelf the size of her hand, the gills underneath like the pages of a closed book. On her right, she passed a stack of oak that had broken out in small, dark brown caps. Along the bark, 100 of them, neat as buttons. Further in, she came to a frame where long, pale, shaggy waterfalls of something white tumbled down from a hanging bag, the strands of it like fine wet wool. And she knew from her grandmother's books that this was lion's mane, and she had only ever seen a drawing of it. Deeper still, in a place where the temperature dropped another 2 degrees and the moisture hung in the air like a held breath, she came to a section of shelf where the substrate was different, darker, richer, worked with something that looked like crushed leaves and pine duff and bits of decayed wood, the way the floor of an old forest looks when you scrape away the top layer with your boot. And out of that forest floor substrate, growing in a way she had only seen in colored plates in a botanical text, came small ruffled cups the color of butter. Chanterelles, or something her grandmother had taught to behave like chanterelles. They were not supposed to grow in a cave. They were not supposed to be cultivated at all. But they were here. They were here because a woman had spent 30 years learning how to ask them to be here. Hazel sank down to the floor of the chamber. She set the lamp beside her. She pressed both hands flat against the cool limestone. She laughed once, a short, surprised, painful laugh that came out of her like something startled out of a thicket. She laughed, and then she stopped laughing because the laugh wanted to turn into something else, and she did not let it. She sat there on the stone floor with mushrooms growing on every side of her, in the gold pool of lamplight, and she breathed. A cathedral. Her grandmother had built a cathedral inside a hill, and the men in town had been laughing for 40 years at a particular woman who lived alone. She sat there a long time. When she got up, the muscles in her legs had gone stiff. She walked the perimeter of the chamber with the lamp held high. She counted log stacks and lost count. She counted wall shelves and lost count. She found in the back left corner of the chamber a small wooden chest with a hinged lid. Inside the chest were tools: a bone-handled knife, a pair of scissors, a small hand scale with brass weights, a leather-bound notebook with a pencil tied to it by a length of waxed string, a wide-mouthed jar half full of something white that she would later learn was sawdust spawn prepared and kept ready by a woman who had not known she would die in December, but had evidently suspected she might. There was a second journal on top of the chest. It was bound in dark cloth and labeled on the cover in her grandmother's small, precise hand, Chamber Procedures. Volume 1. Hazel sat down on the lid of the chest. She opened the journal. She read by the lamp. She did not stop until the lamp ran low and the wick guttered, and she had to walk back out of the cave through the bent passage in the first chamber, and out into a world that had grown dark and cold while she had been gone. It was past midnight when she came out. The stars over the hollow were the kind of stars she had not seen from Charleston in 6 years, sharp and many and indifferent. She walked down to the cabin in the starlight without needing the lamp. She lit the stove. She heated water. She washed the cave dust off her hands and her face. She sat at the table where her grandmother had sat, and she opened the cabin journal again, and she found 3 pages back from the last entry a passage she had not read the first time. The mushrooms are not separate organisms, the passage said. They are the fruit of a single vast network, a web of threads running through the wood and the soil and the stone itself. Feed the network and it feeds you. The cave is not a farm. It is a living thing, and I am its keeper. When I am gone, there must be another keeper. If there is not, the network will go on, but it will go on in the dark, and no one will eat from it. And that will be a kind of dying twice. Hazel set the journal down. She put her head in her hands. She sat that way for a while. Then she stood up. She went to the bed. She lay down in her grandmother's blanket, which still faintly smelled of wood smoke and something dried and herbal. And she slept for the first time in 3 days. And she did not dream. In the morning, she went back into the cave with a fresh trim on the lamp and the second journal under her arm. The work began. She read in the journal what to do, and then she did it. There was a stack of 3 poplar logs near the entrance that had stopped producing the cut ends, gone dry and pale, the bark beginning to slough. The journal said replace. She took the double-bit axe from the tool shed. She went down into the strip of poplar along the creek, and she felled 3 young trees no thicker than her wrist, the way her grandmother had drawn it on a chart pinned to the cabin wall. She bucked them to length. She carried them up to the cave one at a time, balancing each log on her shoulder, the way she had seen men carry beams in newsreels of the docks. She was 16 years old and 95 pounds, and the 3rd log she carried up the slope made her sit down halfway and breathe for 10 minutes before she got back up and finished the climb. But she finished the climb. She inoculated the new logs with sawdust spawn from the white jar in the chest, drilling holes in the bark with a hand brace and bit. She found hanging in the tool shed, packing the spawn into the holes, sealing the holes with melted beeswax from a block on the cabin shelf. She stacked the new logs in the rotation the journal described. butt ends out-kept off the floor on flat stones. She moved the dry logs to a holding row at the back to be burned later in the cook stove. She refreshed the substrate on 3 of the wall shelves with a mix she made up at the cabin table, straw and oak chips and dark leaf mold from under the rhododendron along the path. The proportions copied exactly from a page in the second journal. Every motion was new to her body. Every motion had been done 10,000 times before by another woman in this same cave. By the end of the first week, she had done 7 days of work that would have made a grown man tired. By the end of the second week, she had pared her own meals down to the bare minimum the body would accept, and was eating mostly mushrooms and dandelion greens and wild ramps from along the creek. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. She gained in the muscles of her shoulders and her forearms, and the small of her back, a hardness she had not known her body could make. She did not see another human being for those 2 weeks. She heard once an engine on the road below, slow and low-geared, that did not come up the path. She heard once the distant report of a rifle from somewhere up the ridge. She heard often the bear she had heard her first night, working its way through the laurel in the deep evening. She started leaving a small pile of bruised mushrooms at the edge of the woodshed in case the bear was hungry. The pile was always gone in the morning. She did not know whether the bear took it, or the raccoons did, or the bear and the raccoons together. She did not particularly care. She felt in some way she could not have explained that as long as the bear was eating something, she had set out the bear and she were on terms. On the morning of the 15th day, she came out of the cabin to fetch water, and there was an old woman standing in her dooryard. The old woman was small and tough and dressed in a faded calico work dress with a man's wool coat over it. Her hair was the color of pewter and pulled back in a tight knot. Her face was the face of a woman who had been beautiful at 20, handsome at 40, and now at the back end of 60, had passed beyond either of those into something more useful. She carried a small clay jar in one hand and a long stick in the other. The stick was a walking stick. It was also, Hazel saw, the kind of stick a woman keeps, because a woman alone in these mountains is not a fool. "You'd be the Whitlock girl," the old woman said. "I would. Ruth Hollis. I live 2 miles down the creek. Your grandmother and I were as close to friends as your grandmother was willing to be with anybody." She held out the jar. "Honey," she said, "from my hives. She told me years back that one day a girl would come into this hollow. She told me to bring honey. She said the girl would be too thin and would not know how to feed herself properly." The old woman's eyes ran down Hazel from head to boot and back again. She was not wrong. Hazel took the jar. The jar was warm from being carried inside a coat. "Come inside," Hazel said. Ruth Hollis stepped inside the cabin and stopped just past the threshold and looked at the room with the long, slow look of a person who is taking stock of what has changed since the last time she stood here, which had been, Hazel would learn, about 11 months ago, when she had brought a pot of broth up the path to a dying woman who had told her not to come anymore because the dying was private and the dying woman would prefer to do it alone with her work around her. Ruth Hollis did not comment on what had changed. She walked to the table. She picked up the open journal. She read the last entry. She set it back down. She did not say anything for a moment. "She was waiting for you," she said, finally. "I know. She had no business doing it," Ruth said. "A woman that age, a girl that young, a road this long. But she had a hard kind of faith, the kind that lights one candle in the window and does not go to bed, even though no one ever comes." She looked at Hazel. "You came. I had nowhere else to go." Ruth made a small sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been the sound an older woman makes when she recognizes herself in a younger one across 40 years. That, she said, is how most people come anywhere. Ruth stayed an hour that first morning. She walked the cabin and looked at the charts on the walls. She walked the yard and looked at the garden patch which Hazel had not yet touched. She did not ask to see the cave. Hazel did not offer. There was an understanding between them before they had agreed on it, that the cave was something Hazel would show her when Hazel was ready and not before. When Ruth left, she said she would be back next week. She said she would bring eggs. She said the girl would need eggs if the girl wanted to keep doing whatever it was the girl was doing, because the girl was working like a man and eating like a sparrow. And a body could not run on that for very long without a stop. "I do not have money for eggs," Hazel said. "I did not ask for any," Ruth said. She came back 4 days later, not 7, with eggs in a paper carton and a small canvas sack of cornmeal. She came back the next week with a wool blanket she claimed had been folded in her trunk for 10 years doing nothing. She came back the week after that with a pair of work boots. She said had belonged to her late husband, when he was a boy, boots that had been sitting in her loft since 1882 and were better off on a foot than on a shelf. The boots fit Hazel almost exactly. Hazel did not ask whether Ruth had bought them new in Whitesville and lied about the loft. Ruth would not have answered honestly anyway. On the 3rd visit, Ruth brought one more thing. It was a Winchester rifle. A model 1894 lever action. The bluing gone soft to brown along the barrel. The walnut stock dark with handling. She set it on the table next to the honey jar. She set a small canvas pouch of brass cartridges beside it. "This was my Tom's," Ruth said. "He died in 1928. He was a good shot. He would not mind it being out in the world again in the hands of someone who needed it. He would, however, mind it being out in the world unused. So you are going to learn to use it. I do not have a gun. You do now. I do not know how. You will." In the days that followed, Ruth taught her. They walked up the slope above the cabin to a place where a flat slab of limestone sat at the foot of a dead chestnut, and Ruth tacked a circle of brown paper to the chestnut, and they spent an hour on the first morning with the rifle learning how the lever worked, how to load the magazine, how to seat the round in the chamber, how to set the safety, how to break the action open to check for clear, how to clean the rifle at the kitchen table by the light of the kerosene lamp. Ruth did not let her fire it that first day. She made her dry fire it 20 times, standing 20 times, kneeling 20 times prone. She made her say out loud every time the 4 rules. Treat every gun as loaded. Never point it at anything you are not willing to destroy. Keep your finger off the trigger until you mean to fire. Know what is behind your target. On the second day, Hazel fired 3 rounds at the brown paper at 20 yards. She missed the paper twice and hit it once at the edge. Ruth did not say anything. They walked back to the cabin. Ruth showed her how to clean the rifle again. They did not fire it again that day. On the 3rd day, Hazel put 2 rounds through the circle and 1 through the bark above it. Ruth nodded a 1/4 of an inch. They walked back to the cabin. By the 2nd week, Hazel could put 3 rounds in a 4-inch group at 50 yards from a kneeling rest. She had bruised her shoulder. She had blistered her trigger finger. She had learned how to read the wind across the slope by watching the way the rhododendron leaves turned. Ruth said that was the first thing. Ruth said the second thing, which would take longer, was learning when to fire at all. You will know, Ruth said, because you will not want to. In the same weeks, Ruth taught her the other things. How to set a snare for cottontail along the rabbit runs at the edge of the garden patch. How to dress a squirrel. How to render the small amount of fat off the squirrel for the cornbread. How to read the sky at sundown for the next morning's weather, and the difference between a high mare's tail cirrus that meant rain in 2 days and a low scudding gray that meant rain in 2 hours. How to listen to the creek and tell from its tone whether the water upstream had risen. How to find ramps in the spring and hickory nuts in the fall, and the slow, patient places along the creek where watercress grew. How to bank the stove for the night so the coals would still be live at dawn. How to take a half handful of dry tinder struck off the underside of a fallen oak with the back of a knife and turn it into fire with a single match. Ruth said that last one was the most important because a single match was sometimes all a person had, and the difference between knowing how to use it and not knowing how to use it was the difference between waking up in the morning and not waking up at all. A month passed this way. The cave produced. Hazel harvested. The hanging bags pushed out their slow clusters. The log stacks produced their second flushes. The wall shelves came on with shiitake and oysters, and the patient brown buttons her grandmother had identified in the journal only as little ones. Hazel began by the end of that month to have more mushrooms than she could eat, more than she could share with the bear, more than she could cook down and dry on racks above the stove for winter. She had baskets of them. She had crates of them. They sat in the cool back end of the cabin, layered with newspaper, fresher than anything any grocer in Whitesville had ever sold. It was Ruth who finally said it. "You are going to have to go to town," Ruth said. "You are going to have to sell them. They will not buy from me. Some of them will not. Some of them will. How will I know which? You will not. You will have to walk in and try, and the ones who buy will surprise you, and the ones who don't will not. That is how a town works. That is how every town has always worked." The first Saturday of May, Hazel walked the 12 miles down to Whitesville with 2 baskets covered in clean flour sacking and a small handwritten card in her pocket that read, "Cave-grown mushrooms, fresh, 10 cents a pound." She set up on the boardwalk in front of the feed store because there was nowhere else to set up, and because Mr. Caldwell's office was across the street, and Mr. Caldwell was the only soul in town she could claim to know. She stood there for 3 hours. People walked past her. People looked at her baskets. People did not stop. A man named Earl Sizemore, no relation to Earl Tanner but the same kind of confident, stopped long enough to lift the flour sacking off one of the baskets and look down at the oyster mushrooms underneath. He let the sacking drop. He looked at Hazel. He shook his head slowly. "Cave mushrooms," he said, "from up that hollow." He let out a small, wet laugh through his nose. "Girl, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. Trying to sell poison to honest people." He walked off. A woman stopped after that and almost bought a pound. She had her purse open. She had 2 dimes in her hand. Then she looked past Hazel at the men on the porch of the feed store who were watching the transaction. And she closed her purse, and she said she had changed her mind, and she walked off. Hazel did not cry. She had given that up. But she felt around the middle of the 3rd hour a particular tightness in her throat that was not very far from crying. And she made herself stand straighter, because Ruth had told her that standing straighter was the trick when the throat got tight. At the beginning of the 4th hour, a man came across the street from the courthouse and stopped in front of her baskets. He was older than the others, 60, maybe a little past. He wore a wool vest under a dark coat and a flat-brimmed hat that had seen a war. His right sleeve was pinned up at the shoulder. The empty cuff had been tucked into the pocket of the coat. He walked with his weight slightly forward on his good side, the way a man walks who has been making one arm do the work of 2 for a long time and no longer thinks about it. There was a small bronze star pinned to his vest, the kind of star a county pins on a man when it has elected him sheriff and forgotten to take it back at the end of the term. He stopped in front of her. He looked down into the baskets. He looked up at her face. He did not smile. He had not smiled, she would learn, since 1918. "Boyd McCrae," he said. "Sheriff." He nodded at the baskets. "What kind are these?" "Oyster," she said. "And shiitake. And a few lion's mane in the smaller basket. You grow them all yourself." "My grandmother started them. I am keeping them going." He looked at the baskets again. He looked at the men on the porch of the feed store who had gone very quiet. He looked back at Hazel. "How much for a pound?" 10 cents. That is too cheap. I do not know what to charge." "You charge what they are worth." He pulled a leather coin purse from his vest pocket with his left hand, one-handed, the practiced motion of a man who had done everything one-handed for 24 years. He took out a quarter and a dime. He put them in her palm. He picked up a paper sack she had brought along and held it open for her, and she filled it with oyster mushrooms. He folded the top of the sack closed against the side of his vest. He tucked the sack under the stump of his right arm and held it there, with the pressure of his ribs. He turned to face the men on the porch. "I knew this girl's daddy, Sheriff McCrae," said. He spoke quietly, the way a man speaks who does not need to raise his voice. "Eldon Whitlock. He went down at Black Fork in 1932, and the company never recovered his body. Anybody on this porch remember Eldon Whitlock?" Nobody on the porch said anything. "I do," Sheriff McCrae said. "He was a decent man. He fixed my barn roof one fall when I had no business asking him to. He was raising this little girl with his wife before the fever took the wife, and the mountain took him." He turned back and looked at Hazel for a long moment. "This is his daughter. Anything any of you have to say about her mushrooms, you can say to me first." He tipped his hat at Hazel. He walked back across the street toward the courthouse with the sack of mushrooms tucked under his stump. The woman with the 2 dimes came back 15 minutes later. She did not look at the porch this time. She bought a pound of oysters and a small handful of shiitake, and she paid with 3 dimes and a nickel. After her came a thin woman in a worn coat with 2 small children hanging on her skirts, the wife of a miner who had been drafted, and the thin woman bought a pound for 10 cents and said nothing but thank you. After her came an older woman with the look of a preacher's widow, who bought half a pound and asked quietly how the girl was making out up in that hollow all alone. After her came 3 more women in a small group, and after them a man who would not meet Hazel's eye, but who handed her a quarter and walked off with a sack of lion's mane the size of a small pillow. By 2 o'clock, Hazel had sold out. By the end of June, she had a root. The wife of the drafted miner, Mrs. Edna Pruitt, became her first regular. Mrs. Pruitt told her sister, who told 3 neighbors. The neighbors told the preacher's widow's circle. The preacher's widow's circle told everyone in 3 churches. Hazel walked into Whitesville every Saturday morning with baskets so full she could barely carry them. And by noon, she was empty, and she walked home with $8 or $10 or $12 in her dress pocket, more money than she had ever held in her life. On the 2nd Saturday in July, she came down off the bus stop porch and walked across the street to leave a small basket of dried shiitake at the door of the sheriff's office. He came out before she could turn away. He looked at the basket. He looked at her. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know." He nodded once. He let her go. That afternoon, when she got back to the hollow, there was a county car parked at the end of the path. Earl Tanner was leaning against the door of the car, hat in his hand, the pale blue eyes patient. "Miss Whitlock," he said when she came up the road, "I'm afraid I have some news." He had paper in his other hand. He held it up so she could see it. It was a folded document on heavy stock with a county seal pressed into it in red wax. "This is a notice of tax lien," he said, "issued by the Boone County Tax Office. concerning unpaid back taxes on the property at the end of this road. Your grandmother, it appears, did not pay property taxes for the last 12 years of her life. The total assessment with penalties and interest comes to $340. The county auctioned the lien last month. I bought it." He held the paper out to her. She did not take it. "So now I am the lien holder. By law, you have 30 days from the date of notice to redeem the lien by paying the full amount. If you do not, the lien matures into a deed and the property passes to me." He paused. "The date of notice is today." She felt the slow, steady beat of her heart against her ribs, and she felt her hands go very still at her sides. She did not look at the paper. She looked at his face. She had $8 in her pocket. She had maybe 15 more dollars hidden in a tin under the bed in the cabin. The cave would not produce $340 worth of mushrooms in 30 days, even at 4 times what she was charging. And she could not raise her prices that fast without losing the customers she had only just started to win. "You knew," she said. "I knew what Miss Whitlock. You knew about the back taxes. You waited. You waited for her to die." "I bought a lien at a public auction," he said. "That is all I did. You are welcome to verify the records at the courthouse. They are public." He set the paper on the hood of the car. He took out a cigarette. He lit it one-handed with a brass lighter, snapping the lid shut against the heel of his thumb. 30 days, he said. He got into the car. He backed it down the road. He drove away. Hazel stood at the end of the path for a long time. The notice flapped on the hood of nothing because the car was gone, and the notice was in her hand now, and she did not remember picking it up. She walked up the path. She went into the cabin. She sat down at the table. That night she did not light the lamp. She sat in the dark in her grandmother's chair, and she went through the cabin in her head, room by room, jar by jar, journal by journal, looking for something she had not yet found. Her grandmother had been a particular woman. Her grandmother had not been a careless one. Her grandmother had spent 30 years preparing this hollow for someone who would come. And her grandmother had known at the end that men like Earl Tanner did not stop coming just because an old woman had died. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about the chart of the cave system pinned to the cabin wall. The chart had chambers labeled on it. The main chamber, where the mushrooms grew, was clearly drawn. But there was a line on the chart off the back of the main chamber, a narrow line that ran for perhaps 30 feet, and then ended in a small space labeled in a hand so faint she had not noticed it on her first reading. She had taken it when she noticed it later for an unfinished sketch. A place her grandmother had meant to explore and had not got around to. She lit the lamp. She unpinned the chart from the wall. She held it under the light. The faint hand at the back of the chart had labeled the small space with a single word: vault. She put on her coat. She put on her grandmother's old wool jacket over the coat because the cave was cold at night. She took the lamp and a fresh box of matches and a pry bar from the tool shed. She walked up the slope in the dark with the rifle slung across her back because Ruth had taught her to never go up into that cave alone after sundown without it. And Hazel was learning to listen to Ruth. She walked through the bent passage and into the main chamber. The lamp threw its small gold light across the log stacks and the hanging bags and the patient mushrooms. She walked all the way to the back of the chamber. She walked along the back wall. She had walked along it before. She had not, she realized now, walked along it slowly. She walked it slowly, behind a stack of 3 poplar logs that had been arranged a little too neatly against the wall, almost as if to draw the eye away from what was behind them. She found the narrow passage. It was barely 3 feet wide. It ran back into the rock at a slight downward angle. It was for the first 6 feet an ordinary, natural fissure. Then it was something else. Then it was a wall of stacked stones, limestone slabs, each one about the size of a cinder block, stacked from the floor of the passage to the ceiling of the passage, dry laid, no mortar, no cement, just patient stone on patient stone. The fit was tight. The stack was old. The cobwebs across the face of the stack had not been disturbed in years. Hazel set the lamp on the floor of the passage. She looked at the wall a long time. A rockfall did not stack itself. She picked up the pry bar. She worked for 2 hours. She took the stones down one by one, setting them in 2 careful piles behind her. Because the journal had taught her that you never destroyed what someone before you had built without knowing why they had built it. The stones were heavy. Her hands shook by the end. The lamp burned low. She trimmed it without taking her eyes off the wall. When the hole was big enough to crawl through, she pushed the lamp ahead of her, and she crawled through it. The space on the other side opened into a small dry chamber, maybe 20 feet across. With a ceiling she could just stand under. The air was different here, drier, colder by another degree or two. The walls had been smoothed in places where they would otherwise have wept moisture. The floor was bone dry, and along every wall on shelves carved into the limestone in long, careful rows were jars. Hundreds of jars. Mason jars, canning jars, old medicine bottles. Anything glass, anything that would seal. Each one stoppered tight. Each one labeled in her grandmother's small, precise hand. Each one full of seeds. She walked along the first wall with the lamp held in front of her. She read the labels. Cherokee purple tomato. Saved from my mother's garden, 1898. Last refresh, 1937. Trail of tears bean. From my mother. Hers from her mother. Hers from the walk. Last refresh, 1939. Bloody butcher corn. The 1902 strain. Believed lost. Not lost. Last refresh, 1938. Candy roaster squash. Long pink. From the koala. Last refresh, 1940. Greasy grits green bean. From Mr. Hooper before he passed. Turkey crawbean. Cherokee white flour corn. Cherokee. Sacred. Last refresh, 1936. She read until the labels began to blur. She found a stool in one corner of the chamber. A small 3-legged stool that her grandmother had evidently set there for the purpose of sitting and reading the labels. She sat down on it. She held the lamp on her knee. She looked around the chamber at the hundreds of jars, at the careful labels, at the dates that went back 40 years, and the dates that went back longer than that, at the small folded papers tucked behind some of the larger jars, papers that she would unfold later and find were letters from her grandmother to her grandmother's mother, written across decades, written in 2 languages, written in a hand that wept and laughed and remembered. A seed vault. Her grandmother had built a seed vault inside the back of a cave. Hazel held the lamp in both hands so it would not shake. She breathed. She understood, sitting there on the stool in the dry chamber, surrounded by 40 years of one woman's patient defiance against forgetting that the mushrooms had only ever been part of the answer. The mushrooms were the harvest. The mushrooms were what her grandmother had used to live. But this room was something else. This room was the reason. This room was what a particular woman in a hollow on Kenny's Creek had been protecting for 40 years from men like Earl Tanner, and his fathers and his uncles and his grandfathers, the men who had been taken and taken and taken from these mountains since before any of them were born. She thought then of Earl Tanner's pale blue eyes on the slope behind her cabin. She thought of the 30 days. She picked up the lamp. She stood up off the stool. She walked over to the section of shelves where her grandmother had labeled the oldest jars. She put her hand on a jar labeled Trail of Tears Bean. From my mother. Hers from her mother. Hers from the walk. She did not pick it up. She just rested her hand on the cool glass. She said out loud in the quiet of the chamber, the only thing that came to her, I will not let him have you. She walked back to the cabin in the gray hour before dawn, with the rifle slung across her back and the lantern guttering low, and her mind already at work on the problem. 30 days, $340, 8 in her pocket, 15 under the bed, and a cave that produced food, but did not produce money fast enough. She did the arithmetic at the kitchen table by the light of the rekindled stove. She did it 3 times. The numbers did not improve. Even if she doubled her prices and tripled her output, and walked every Saturday into Whitesville for the next 4 weekends, with baskets she could barely carry, she would come up short by more than half. She had a vault full of seeds worth more than gold to the right person, but the right person had not yet been told they existed, and she did not know how to find that person. And Earl Tanner was not going to wait while she figured it out. She slept 2 hours on the floor in front of the stove, with her boots still on. She woke when she heard a hen scream in the small chicken pen Ruth had helped her build at the side of the cabin. She went out with the rifle. She found the pen with the wire bent down, and one Rhode Island red dead in the dirt, and another missing. The bent wire was not a fox. A fox would have squeezed under, not bent the wire down from the top. The bent wire was a boot heel. She walked the perimeter of the cabin in the cold gray light. She found 2 sets of boot prints in the soft ground behind the woodshed. She found a third set up the slope toward the cave entrance, stopping 15 feet short of the cleared limestone, lingering there and turning back. The prints had not gone inside. They had only come to look. She stood looking down at those prints for a long time. They were fresh. Whoever had made them had stood right there a few hours ago in the dark, considering the opening she had spent 3 days uncovering. She walked back to the cabin. She lit the lamp again. She wrote by lamplight a short letter on the back of a feed store receipt she had been keeping in her grandmother's tin. The letter was to a name she had found in the back of one of her grandmother's journals. A name underlined twice and marked with a small star. Dr. Eleanor Reeves, Department of Botany, Marshall College, Huntington. Her grandmother had written beside the name only 3 words, "She will understand." Hazel did not know whether the name was current. She did not know whether the woman was still alive. She did not know whether a letter sent to a college 60 miles away would reach a desk in time to matter. But she wrote it anyway. She described in plain words what she had found in the back chamber of the cave. She listed 8 of the labels she remembered. She put down the address of the cabin, which was no address at all, but on the end of Kenny's Creek Road, Boone County. She walked the letter 4 miles to a tin mailbox at the head of a side road, slipped it in, raised the small red flag, and walked back. When she got back, Ruth Hollis was on the porch. Ruth had a long canvas duffel beside her on the boards. Ruth had her own rifle across her knees, an older model octagon barreled the wood polished by 60 years of one family's hands. Ruth did not look at Hazel when Hazel came up the path. She looked out past the path toward the road. "I had a visit last night," Ruth said. "From who?" 2 men. Strangers. Not from this hollow. They asked very politely whether I knew a girl who lived up the road. I told them I did not. They asked again. I told them again. They asked a 3rd time. The 3rd time I asked them very politely to leave. She finally looked at Hazel. They left. But they will be back. And they will not be coming to my place next time. Ruth set the rifle aside. She unzipped the canvas duffel. Inside were 2 folded wool blankets, a sack of cornmeal, a tin of coffee, 4 candles, and a stoppered glass jar, half full, of black powder that Hazel had not been expecting to see. Ruth did not explain the powder. Ruth said only, "We are going to set the porch up so that anyone who comes onto it after dark steps on a board that talks. I have done this before. It is not difficult." Hazel said, "You do not have to stay." Ruth said, "I am not staying. I am setting up. Then I am going home. Then if there is shooting, I am coming back. You are 16 and you are alone and you have 10 people in this county on your side and 400 not, and 300 of those 400 do not know you exist yet. But the 100 who do are about to be told a great many things by a man with money. So we will use the next 4 weeks to make this porch and this dooryard and this cabin a place that does not surprise easily." They worked the rest of that morning. Ruth showed her where to lift a porch board and set a strip of taut cord beneath it that would chime against a tin can in the kitchen if any weight came onto the board. She showed her where to wedge a wooden peg in the door frame that would fall and rattle on the floor if the door was eased open from outside. She showed her how to set a wire across the path at shin height, 6 paces from the corner of the cabin where the shadow was deepest. The wire low enough that a deer would step over it, but a man in the dark would not see it. She showed her how to use the heavy lid of the woodbox as a brace against the inside of the door at night. Ruth did not say the word ambush. Ruth said only, "A cabin is a thing you live in. After dark, when men with intentions are in the woods, a cabin is also a thing you fight from. The trick is to remember which it is and when." By the time Ruth left, the sun was overhead, and Hazel had a cabin that talked back to anyone who came to it uninvited. That afternoon, she walked into Whitesville with 2 baskets. The walk took her 3 hours instead of the usual 2.5 because she stopped every quarter mile and listened. The road was empty. Nobody followed her. Nobody had to. In Whitesville, she sold out her baskets in 90 minutes. She made $14. She walked back. She added the $14 to the tin. The tin now held $37. She was $303 short of $340, and she had 28 days. On the 18th day, Sheriff McCrae drove up the road in his county car. He did not get out. He cranked the window down and rested his good arm on the doorframe and waited until Hazel came down the path to him. "I heard about the lien," he said. "I figured you had. You know it was not a lien sold at any auction I had public notice of. I figured that too." He nodded slowly. He looked off down the road for a moment. He looked back at her. "I cannot do anything official," he said. "The paper he served you with is on county letterhead. The county clerk signed it. I do not know yet whether the clerk signed it because she was paid to or because she was scared to read it twice. Either way, she signed it. Until I know which one, I am a sheriff who has been told to leave a tax matter to the tax office." "I understand. What I can do," he said, "is drive this road once a day. Every day. Until the 30 days are up. I cannot stop a man on private business. But a county car at the end of a road tends to slow down what some men think is private business." He paused. "And if you hear anything in the night, you fire 2 rounds into the air 10 seconds apart. 2 rounds, 10 seconds. I will hear them from the road, and the road is where I'm going to be every night between now and the end of this month. You cannot sleep in a county car for 30 nights. I have slept in worse for longer." He cranked the window back up. He raised one finger off the steering wheel by way of farewell. He drove off. Hazel stood there a moment in the road. On the 20th day, Earl Tanner came back. He came in the middle of the morning in the same county car, alone this time. He parked at the end of the path. He walked up to the dooryard. He took his hat off when he saw her, the same courtesy as before. He did not bring up the lien. He brought up instead an envelope. "I have an offer, Miss Whitlock," he said. "A different one. Better than the first." "How different?" He held out the envelope. She did not take it. $400 cash. Today. In exchange for a quitclaim deed signed over to me. You walk out of this hollow with $60 more than the lien is worth. You owe nobody. You go to any town you choose. You are 16 years old and you have your whole life ahead of you. And you do not have to spend any of it fighting a man who has already won. I'm not fighting you. You are about to be. I do not have to fight you. The deed is in my name. The tax office records will show whatever you have arranged for them to show. But the courthouse is not the only place a record can be kept. I have written some letters this week, Mr. Tanner, to people who are not in Whitesville, people who will be interested in what is in my grandmother's cave, not the mushrooms. The other thing. He did not blink, but something in the pale blue eyes shifted half a hair, and she saw it and she went on. If your lien matures and this property passes to you, those people will want to know how. They will ask questions. They will ask them loud, and they will ask them in Charleston, and they will ask them in print. So you may take this hollow from me, sir. I cannot stop you. But you will not take it quietly." He looked at her a long moment. She had bluffed him about the letters more than she had told the truth. She had sent one. She did not yet know whether the one had reached anyone who would answer. But she had said it with her chin up the way Ruth had taught her to stand at the boardwalk on the first Saturday. And Earl Tanner was a man who had spent 40 years reading other people's faces. He read hers. He put the envelope back in his coat pocket. "You are a stubborn child," he said. "I am." He set his hat back on his head. He walked back to the car. He drove off. She stood there until the dust of him had settled, and then she walked into the cabin and sat down at the table and put her face in her hands and shook for a full minute before she let herself stand back up. On the 23rd day, a letter came back. It came care of the feed store. Mr. Caldwell brought it up the road himself in his pickup because he had thought it looked important. The envelope was on heavy stock from Marshall College. The handwriting was a woman's, narrow and careful and exact. Hazel opened it at the kitchen table while Mr. Caldwell waited on the porch. The letter said this: "Dear Miss Whitlock, your letter found me on a Tuesday afternoon and I have not slept the same since. I will be at the end of your road on Saturday morning. I am bringing my husband to drive my colleague Dr. Atkins to witness and a checkbook from a fund I administer for the preservation of agricultural heritage in this state. If even half of what you describe is in that chamber, the fund will be very interested in arranging a stewardship grant for its long-term protection. Please do not let anyone enter the chamber before I arrive. Eleanor Reeves." Hazel read it twice. She read it 3 times. She stood up. She walked to the porch and handed it to Mr. Caldwell, who read it with his eyebrows climbing slowly up his forehead. And when he was done, he handed it back to her and said only, "Well now, Miss Whitlock. Well now." That was a Wednesday. Saturday was 3 days away. On the 25th day, Earl Tanner stopped pretending. It was a Friday. The night was warm for May, and the moon was a hard, bright thing in the sky, and the woods were full of small noises, and Hazel was lying on the floor in front of the stove with the rifle beside her, and a blanket pulled to her chin, and her eyes half open the way Ruth had taught her to lie when she did not want to be fully asleep. She heard the porch board talk. It was the 3rd board from the left, the one that ran the cord under it to the tin can in the kitchen, and the cord went tight. and the tin can shifted on the shelf and made the small, dry sound it had been put there to make. Hazel was on her feet before the sound had finished. She had the rifle in her hands and a round in the chamber. She moved to the side of the doorway with her back against the log wall so that the door would not swing open onto her. A voice on the porch said quietly, "Miss Whitlock, come out, please. Your cave is about to have an accident." She did not answer. The voice said louder, "We have already poured kerosene at the entrance. You have 1 minute to come out before we light it. Your mushrooms will burn. Your shelves will burn. Whatever else you have in there will burn. I do not particularly want to do this, but I am running out of time. And so are you. Come out." She did not answer. She heard the voice say then to someone else on the porch, "Light it." She heard a match strike. She fired through the open window at an angle calculated not to hit the porch, but to hit the post at the corner of the porch. The heavy oak corner post in the rifle round took a piece of bark the size of a fist out of that post and sang off into the dark. The match dropped. A man cursed. 2 pairs of boots came off the porch fast and heavy. She moved to the window. She fired the second round straight up into the night sky, 2 seconds after the first. She made herself wait. She counted. At 10 seconds, she fired a third round into the air. Then she pulled the lever and stepped out onto the porch in her grandmother's wool jacket, with the rifle leveled, and she walked slow and steady, and not looking down at the boards around the side of the cabin, and up the slope toward the cave. 2 men were at the cave entrance. One held a kerosene can. The other had a rag in his hand and was trying to light it again from a fresh match cupped against the wind. The pale glow of his cupped flame lit his face for a second, and the face she did not recognize, but the man behind him she recognized from a photograph she had seen once on the wall of Mr. Caldwell's office, in a group shot of the Boone County Coal Operators Association, taken in 1939. Earl Tanner stood about 10 feet back from the entrance with his hands in his coat pockets and his hat low over his eyes. He turned his head when he heard her come up the slope. "I'd put the can down, sir," she said. The man with the kerosene can did not put it down. The man with the rag finally got the match to the rag, and the rag caught with a small, soft whoomp, and the rag burned in his hand like a torch. He looked past Hazel down the slope at her cabin at the moon at the cave entrance, and then at his employer. He waited. Hazel did not look at the men with the can and the rag. She looked at Earl Tanner. "Mr. Tanner," she said, "tell them to put it out." Earl Tanner did not move. "2 more rounds in this rifle," she said. "I have been practicing. Ruth Hollis taught me. She does not miss. I do not either, not at this distance." A new voice came up the slope behind her, calm and slow, the voice of a woman who had walked uphill in the dark with another rifle in her hands. "The girl is right," Ruth Hollis said. "She does not miss. And neither do I. And there are 2 of you holding the burning end, and 1 of you giving the orders, and any one of the 3 of you we shoot would be a fair shoot under the laws of this state. Because that fire on that rag is on my neighbor's property, without her consent." Earl Tanner stood very still. A third voice came up the road below the cabin, a man's voice calling out over the trees, and then the headlights of a county car swept up through the rhododendron tunnel and stopped at the end of the path. And Sheriff Boyd McCrae's voice, the same voice that had spoken quietly on the boardwalk on a Saturday in May, said, "Earl, tell your boy to put that rag in the dirt. Do it now." Earl Tanner closed his eyes for half a second. He opened them. He said, "Put it out." The man with the rag dropped it on the limestone at his feet and stamped it into wet stone with the heel of his boot until the flame died and the rag smoldered and then went black. The man with the can lowered the can to the ground. Neither of them looked at Hazel. Sheriff McCrae came up the slope with his one hand resting on the grip of the service revolver at his hip. He did not draw the revolver. He did not need to. Earl the sheriff said, "Sheriff, I am going to take these two boys into custody on a charge of arson and attempted destruction of private property. I am going to take you into custody on a charge of conspiracy to the same. I am also going to take into custody at the courthouse in the morning the lien you served on this girl, because Mr. Caldwell came down to my office at 6 o'clock this evening with a folder of things he found in the county clerk's files this afternoon, when the clerk was out, and the lien you served on this girl was filed against a tax delinquency that does not exist on the rolls. Cora Whitlock paid her property tax every year for 40 years, sometimes late, always paid. Mr. Caldwell has the receipts. Mr. Caldwell has them in a folder right now, sitting on my desk." Earl Tanner did not answer. The sheriff said, "You forged a lien against a 16-year-old orphan to take a piece of land you have wanted for 20 years. And tonight you came up here with two boys and a can of kerosene because you knew tomorrow morning the paper would not hold." He looked past Earl at the dark mouth of the cave. "I do not know what is in that cave, Earl, and I do not need to. I know what is in front of it." He looked back. "Hands behind your head, please." Earl Tanner put his hands behind his head. The sheriff walked him down off the slope, one-handed, the empty cuff of his other sleeve still pinned at the shoulder. The service revolver still in its holster. The way a man walks who has not needed to draw a gun in a long time, because the gun is not what the gun is for. Ruth Hollis lowered her rifle. She let out a long breath. The girl Ruth said quietly did not miss. The girl did not miss. The girl had also not fired at a person. The girl had fired at a corner post on purpose to drop a match. Ruth had seen the shot. Ruth would later tell her, much later in a kitchen full of grown children and grandchildren, that the moment Ruth had decided Hazel would be all right in this hollow was the moment Ruth had watched her fire deliberately into wood instead of into a man. Hazel walked down off the slope on legs that did not feel like hers. She sat on the porch step. She put the rifle across her knees the way her grandmother must have done 1,000 nights for 40 years. She watched the sheriff load 3 men into the back of the county car. She watched the headlights swing around and disappear down the road. She watched the dust settle in the moonlight. Ruth sat down beside her on the step. Ruth did not say anything for a while. After a while, Ruth said, "He was going to burn it. He was going to burn it all. Yes. If you had not woken when you did. Yes." Ruth put her hand on top of Hazel's hand on the rifle. Her hand was old and dry and warm. She did not say anything else. On Saturday morning, Dr. Eleanor Reeves came up the road. She came in a black Ford with her husband driving and Dr. Atkins, a thin gray man, in spectacles in the back seat. She was a tall woman, perhaps 45, with the kind of plain face that becomes beautiful when it begins to listen. She wore a wool skirt and stout walking boots and a long coat over a sweater. She carried a leather satchel that turned out to contain, among other things, a notebook, a magnifying loupe, a pair of cotton gloves, and a fountain pen. She also carried a small leather folder that turned out to contain a checkbook from a private foundation called the Allegheny Heritage Trust. Hazel met them at the end of the path. She took them to the cabin first. She showed them the journals on the table and the charts on the walls. Dr. Reeves stood in front of the chart of the cave system for a long time and did not say anything. Then they walked up the slope to the cave. In the main chamber by lantern light, Dr. Reeves moved among the log stacks and the wall shelves and the hanging bags, the way a person moves through a place of worship. She did not speak for a long time. Dr. Atkins took notes. Her husband, who turned out to be a quiet farmer named Mr. Reeves, stood near the entrance with his hat off and his eyes wet. Hazel led them through the bent passage at the back. She led them past the 3 poplar logs. She led them through the gap in the stacked stone wall she had taken down and put back up loosely so that it could be lifted aside as a door. She led them into the dry chamber. Dr. Eleanor Reeves stood in the doorway of the seed vault and put her hand on the limestone of the wall. She did not move. After a moment, she walked slowly along the first row of shelves. She read labels. She bent down and read the smaller labels on the lower shelves. She came to a jar labeled Bloody Butcher Corn, the 1902 strain, believed lost. Not lost. She lifted the jar with both gloved hands as if it were a sleeping child. She held it up to the lantern. The kernels inside were the color of dried garnets, dark and gleaming and old. This variety, Dr. Reeves said very quietly, has been considered extinct since 1918. The last recorded planting was the year of the Great Influenza. After that, every effort to find living seed failed. There were 3 private collections that were rumored to have some, and all 3 burned in barn fires between 1921 and 1929. The official position of the State Agricultural Service since 1930 has been that this variety no longer exists. She set the jar back on the shelf with both hands. Your grandmother saved it. She saved a lot of things, Hazel said. Dr. Reeves walked along the second wall. She bent down. She came up holding a jar labeled Cherokee White Flour Corn. Sacred. She held it for a long time. I am going to need, she said finally, my notebook. She cataloged for 6 hours. By mid-afternoon, she had counted 247 jars and was not yet half done. By the end of the day, she had counted 311. And Dr. Atkins had filled most of his own notebook with cross-references, and Mr. Reeves had quietly walked down to the cabin 3 times to bring up coffee from a thermos his wife had packed in the car. At dusk in the cabin, with the journals open on the table and the seed vault catalog half-finished beside them, Dr. Reeves wrote out a check. She wrote it for the amount of the back taxes plus $100. She tore it out of the book and pushed it across the table to Hazel. That, she said, is a one-time payment from the trust to cover the immediate emergency. The trust does not normally cover tax obligations. The trust will cover it once, because if you lose this property in the next 10 days, every variety in that chamber goes with it. She paused. The longer-term arrangement will be a stewardship grant, $200 a year for the next 10 years in exchange for the trust having documented access to the collection, a copy of all your grandmother's notes, and your written agreement to continue the preservation work under guidelines we will draw up together. You will be the steward of record. The collection remains yours. The land remains yours. The cave remains yours. We are buying access to the future Miss Whitlock, not your past. Hazel took the check in both hands. The paper was very thin. The amount written on it was $440. She had never seen a check before. She had only seen photographs of one in a magazine at the orphanage. She looked at it a long time. She set it on the table. Yes, she said. Dr. Eleanor Reeves nodded once. Mr. Reeves by the door put his hat back on. 3 days later, in Mr. Caldwell's office above the feed store, Hazel signed 2 pieces of paper. The first was a tax payment receipt for $340 paid in cash from the cashed check signed by the county clerk under the watchful eye of Sheriff McCrae. The lien Earl Tanner had served on her was by the same hand of the same clerk, marked void and stamped in red. The second was the stewardship agreement with the Allegheny Heritage Trust, drawn up by Mr. Caldwell, from notes Dr. Reeves had sent him by mail. Hazel signed her name on the second one in a careful, schoolgirl hand. Her name on that page would decades later be the first signature in a record of stewardship that would grow to 17 names by the end of the century. She walked back up the hollow that afternoon in the May sun with a copy of each paper, folded inside her grandmother's wool jacket, and a deed in her own name that no man could lift from her. That should have been the end. It was not the end. It was the middle of the day she had been told was the end. She went into the cabin to put the papers away. She had decided to keep them in the chest at the back of the main chamber of the cave, where her grandmother had kept the procedures journal, because that was the safest place she knew. She went down on her knees at the chest. She opened the lid. She moved the procedures journal aside. Underneath the procedures journal, in the corner of the chest, was a small bundle she had not noticed on her first inspection. It was wrapped in a square of waxed cloth and tied with a piece of waxed twine. She lifted it out. She untied the twine. She unfolded the cloth. Inside the cloth was a small glass jar with no label. Inside the jar were perhaps 24 bean seeds, the color and pattern of which she recognized at once from the labels she had been reading in the back chamber for 3 days. They were Trail of Tears beans, and tucked beside the jar, folded in quarters, was a piece of paper. She unfolded the paper. The handwriting on it was not her grandmother's. The handwriting was rounder, younger, tired. The ink was brown with age, and the paper was creased deep along the folds. The date at the top was October 14th, 1925. She read it. "Mama," the letter said, "I am writing this in the cabin while you are out at the cave. You do not know I am writing it. You will find it after I am gone. I cannot say to your face what I have to say, so I am saying it to a piece of paper that you will read alone, which is the way you have always preferred to receive anything important anyway. I am carrying a child. The child is due in March. I have known for 9 weeks. I have not told you because I knew if I told you, you would ask me to stay. And I knew if you asked me to stay, I might say yes, and I cannot say yes. I love you. I love this hollow. I love what you do in the cave, and what you do in the back chamber, and what you have taught me about the network in the ground that holds everything else together. But I cannot live the way you live, Mama. I cannot live a life that is mostly underground and mostly alone and mostly facing towards something 100 years from now instead of toward the people across the table from me tonight. I am not strong enough. I am sorry. You raised a daughter who is not strong enough. I am going to Charleston. I am going to find work. I am going to have this child. I am going to raise her, if she is a girl in the world above the ground. I am going to take with me from your shelves one jar, only the one with my grandmother's beans in it. I will plant them in whatever yard I can find every year for as long as I'm able, so that the line does not break in my hands. If the child is a girl, I'm going to name her Hazel. Hazel is the wood of the divining rod, the wood that finds water in dry places. She will need to find water in dry places. I expect her life will be dry. I do not know when, if ever, she will come back to you. I do not know whether you will live to see her. I am leaving this letter and this jar in the chest in the cave on the night I leave, because the chest is the one place in this hollow no one but you will ever open. If she comes, she will open it eventually. If she comes, she will read this. If she comes, she will know that her mother loved her grandmother enough to write a goodbye, and that her mother loved her enough to name her after a wood that finds water. Goodbye, Mama. Forgive me if you can. Your daughter, Sarah Hazel, sat back on her heels on the cold limestone floor. She read the letter again. She read it a third time. She read it a fourth. She had not known her mother's mother had been there, at her mother's leaving. She had not known her mother had carried her down out of these mountains in her belly. She had not known that her name had been given to her. Not at random. Not because her mother liked the sound of it, but because a young woman in a cabin in October of 1925 had stood at a table in lamplight and made a promise to her own mother about how a granddaughter would be named. She had not known that for 17 years between October of 1925 and the December her grandmother died, an old woman alone in this hollow had been waiting not for a guess, not for a possibility, but for a name, for Hazel, for the wood of the divining rod, for the granddaughter she had been promised. She did not cry. She had given that up at 12. But she put both hands flat on the floor of the cave, and she let her head bow forward over the open letter, and her shoulders shook once very briefly, and then once more, and then they stopped. She folded the letter back into quarters. She set it inside the jar with the beans. She rewrapped the jar in the waxed cloth. She tied the twine. She put the bundle back in the chest. She closed the lid. She walked back down to the cabin in the long slant of May light. The mountains were turning the color they turn in mid-May, the deep tired green that goes through summer, into the slow yellow of August. The creek ran low and clear over its stones. A wood thrush sang somewhere in the laurel. She walked past her grandmother's chair on the porch, the one that had been rocking when she first came up the path 9 weeks ago, and she sat down in it. She rocked once, twice. The chair made the small, dry sound it had been making since 1910. She sat there until the light went out of the sky. In the years after that May, the hollow filled with the noise of work and the noise of children. Wendell Reese came up the road in the autumn of 1945, a thin, quiet man home from the Pacific who had heard in a barber shop in Mingo County about a girl with a cave full of mushrooms, and who had driven over to see the cave and stayed to see her. They married in the fall of 1947, in front of Mr. Caldwell and Sheriff McCrae, and Ruth Hollis and Dr. Eleanor Reeves on the porch of the cabin with the cave open behind them, and a jar of Cherokee Trail of Tears beans on the porch rail as a witness. They raised 3 children in that cabin, 2 girls and a boy, and every one of those children learned to tend the cave and the terraces and the seeds before they learned to read. Earl Tanner served 4 years in the state penitentiary at Moundsville and came home to find that his mine had been sold during his absence to a company in Pittsburgh. He died in 1958 of an old man's heart attack in a kitchen that no longer belonged to him. Sheriff Boyd McCrae drove up to the hollow on the first Saturday of every month until his retirement in 1949. He would sit on the porch and drink coffee with one hand and let Ruth Hollis carry the conversation. And when he finally died in 1962, he was buried with a folded paper sack in his breast pocket that his daughter, going through his things, recognized at once as the kind of paper sack Hazel had used the day she sold him a pound of oyster mushrooms for 35 cents in front of the feed store. Ruth Hollis died on a bright October day in 1953 at 79. Hazel buried her on the hill above the cabin where she could see the terraces, and Hazel planted Cherokee purple tomatoes on her grave because Ruth had once said they were the best thing she had ever tasted, and she wanted to taste them forever. The Whitlock Heritage Seed Bank, as Dr. Eleanor Reeves formally named it in her cataloging report, grew every year. By the 1960s, the collection held over 400 varieties. By the 1970s, it was recognized by the United States Department of Agriculture as one of the most significant private seed preservation efforts in the eastern half of the country. Farmers came, scientists came, reporters came. Indigenous community representatives from the eastern band of the Cherokee came in 1971 to receive in a small ceremony on the porch of the cabin. the return of 3 sacred corn varieties that their elders had not seen alive since before the boarding school years. Hazel stood on that porch with Wendell beside her, and a great-grandson of her grandmother's old neighbor, Ruth, holding a basket of seed jars, and she handed each jar across with both hands. She kept tending the cave herself until the very end. Every morning she walked into that limestone chamber and checked the temperature and the humidity and the logs and the bags and the shelves and talked to the network in the ground, the way her grandmother must have talked to it for 30 years before her. Wendell died in the autumn of 1979, quietly on the porch with soup on the stove. She buried him next to Ruth. She died in the spring of 1986 at 60. Her oldest daughter found her in the cave, sitting on the small 3-legged stool in the seed vault with a jar in her lap. The label on the jar read, "Trail of Tears Bean. From my mother. Hers from her mother. Hers from the walk." Her daughter said she looked peaceful. Her son said she looked like she was home. The cave is still producing. The seed bank holds over 600 varieties now managed by Hazel's granddaughter and a staff of 12. The mushroom operation supplies half the restaurants in southern West Virginia. Every spring, the family holds the Cora Whitlock Heritage Seed Festival on the terraces above the hollow. And families come from across the state to trade seeds and swap stories and plant things that should have been lost, but were not. Above the cave entrance, cut into the limestone where Cora Whitlock carved her name in 1913, Hazel's children added a second line in 1986. It reads in letters as deep and careful as the first. H. Whitlock Reese. She cleared the way. So let me ask you something, you who have listened this long. What is growing behind the vines in your life? What did somebody who came before you spend their last years protecting in the hope that you would come along one day with patience enough and stubbornness enough to clear the door? What overgrown entrance do you walk past every morning on your way to work, assuming there is nothing inside worth the bleeding hands and the bruised shoulders and the 3 days of cutting? Cora Whitlock spent 40 years building a cathedral inside a mountain. And then she let the forest grow over the door, and she trusted that the right person would come along and open it. She was right, not because the girl was special, because the girl had nowhere else to go, and because she was desperate enough to start cutting, and because she was patient enough to keep cutting after her hands bled. The vines are not the obstacle. They never were. The vines are the test. What is behind them is always worth the work. If this story moved you, do me one small favor. Go look today at the overgrown door in your own life. The one you have been telling yourself for years there is nothing behind. Take a sickle. Take a pair of gloves. Stand in front of it and say out loud, the way Hazel Whitlock said in front of a wall of kudzu in March of 1942. All right, show me. Then start cutting. Your grandmother is waiting.